This is going to be one of those buckle-up homilies. Yes, as you know, I'm not a politically correct person, but that's probably good, because what we hear in today's gospel is that what a Christian is called to be. You don't concern yourself with others' opinions. You don't regard a person's status. You speak and are a truthful man and teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. So I hope you would expect nothing less of your priest. The gospel today clearly shows what I would call the divine genius of Jesus. The more I read the Gospels, the more I listen to what Jesus says in the Gospels, the more I am truly convinced of what our faith tells us. Jesus is God. Notice that every situation in which there is deception, people try to snare Jesus, they try to trap him in his speech. And Jesus, not only in his response, is able to quote-unquote escape their trap, but he actually uses their deceit. He uses their conniving to teach the profound truth of God. And today's gospel is a perfect example of this. Repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. And my hope is that at the end of this homily you will truly understand how profound this one phrase is. What does it mean to repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God? Well, the profound truth that Jesus is revealing is the duty we have as Christians regarding the state and regarding our loyalty to God. The Catholic Church, and of course following Jesus Christ, because we know that Jesus founded the Catholic Church, tells us that the state, or the country we live in, deserves our loyalty and support. The Catechism of the Catholic Church in 2240 says, "Submission to authority and co-responsibility for the common good makes it morally obligatory to pay taxes, to exercise the right to vote, and to defend one's country." No matter what you think of the IRS, you must morally pay your taxes. It's interesting that the Catechism says that our, if you want to say, loyalty or support of the state comes under what we call the fourth commandment, to honor your mother and father. In other words, the Catechism is saying that we as Catholics are obliged to honor, respect, and obey every legitimate authority, whether it be our parents, whether it be legitimate governments. But notice what the Pharisees tried to do, and Jesus, in his profound divine genius, exposes. Jesus exposes the question of the Pharisees as what I would call a false dilemma, a false dichotomy. Or pay tax to Caesar, or support the state, or be a good Jew, be a good Catholic. What Jesus is telling us is that this is a false dichotomy, because as Catholics, we must be good and faithful citizens. We must understand that political and religious obligations can absolutely be legitimately met. In other words, serving God does not exempt us from paying taxes. Quite the contrary. As Catholics, we are called to be honest and effective citizens. And hear this well. Anyone who sponges, and I have to use that word, off the government, who purposely works just a sufficient amount not to qualify or to qualify for some social benefit, is committing a terrible moral evil. This is the teaching of the Catholic Church. If we are not being faithful and responsible citizens, if we are not supporting the common good but seeking solely our own good at the expense of the government, then we are committing a horrible sin. But notice, though, that Christ is not just saying that our obedience to the state is a blind obedience. No, Christ is not saying that at all. Christ reminds us that there is no imperative of what we would call an uncritical obedience to the state. We can never accept something that is immoral, even if the state asks us to accept it. Because the words of Christ underscore the truth that yes, we are called to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but our supreme allegiance is not to Caesar. Our supreme allegiance as Catholics is not to the state. Our supreme allegiance as Christians is to God. And as Christians, and this is where Christ points out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, as Christians, we don't believe in a dichotomy, or the state or God. We believe in a hierarchy. There is a supreme value, and that value is not the state. The supreme good in our lives as Christians is God. And if we truly acknowledge God as the supreme good, then we will be good and faithful citizens. There's not a dichotomy, but actually a need to be better Catholics in order to be better citizens. Brothers and sisters, as Christians, as Catholics, we have to understand that faith is a unity. It's not a dichotomy. It's not either faith or works. It is faith and works. Our Catholic faith is the way we should see everything in our life. The state, government, our families, our relationships. And the moment an authority in my life, whether it be the state or any other authority, commands us to do something that is contrary to the law of God, that authority ceases to be legitimate. For example, the fourth commandment tells us that parents are a legitimate authority over their children. But if a parent says to a child, "You must obey me and jump out the window," don't jump out the window. Now, so I'm sad that I have to explain it to some people, but please understand, if you are told to do something by an authority that is evil or intrinsically wrong, you cannot do it. If a parent commands a child to get an abortion, the parent no longer is legitimate authority because they are commanding something that is contrary to the law of God. God's law is the supreme good, not the law of the state. And therefore, brothers and sisters, we have to understand that if we're going to be responsible citizens, we must do everything to see that all we believe and live as Catholics is in absolute accord with the law of God. Now, I think many of us will remember what happened after the Second World War. The Nazis were involved in something called the Nuremberg trials. They were on trial in the city of Nuremberg in Germany. And many of the Nazis claimed, well, I didn't want to do these evil things, but I was under obedience. Were they excused because they were under obedience? Absolutely not. Obedience never excuses us or permits us to do something immoral. And that's why Christ's response that we are called to give to God what is God's highlights the truth that the claims of Caesar, the claims of the state, are subordinate to the claims of God. And how does Jesus do this? Let us listen to the words of Jesus. Jesus asks those who are in front of him asking the question to produce the coin that is used to pay the census tax. And he says, "Whose image and whose inscription is on the coin?" They respond, "Caesar's." Then our Lord says, well, if this is something with the image of Caesar, it must be given back to Caesar. It belongs to him. But this then begs the question, what belongs to God? What, or better said, who bears the image of God? The human person. The human person bears the image of the living God. We do not belong to the state. We don't even belong to our own parents. As living persons, as human beings, we belong first and foremost to God, who is our Creator. And therefore, brothers and sisters, in order to give back to God what is God, we must understand that the most important obligation in our life is to give ourselves continually back to God because we are made in His image. How do we give ourselves back to God? Through worship of God, through obedience to His divine will. And here, I know that I won't receive any stones thrown in my direction, maybe after Mass, but not now. Parents who teach their kids to do things like they need to go to school, they need to be honest, they need to do these things, that's certainly very good. But they truly fail as parents if they fail to tell their children that you, as made in the image and likeness of God, have a supreme obligation in life to worship God, to recognize God, to obey God. This is the most important obligation in the life of any human being. And parents, you have this duty to teach your children this. Christ is saying that we must recognize that God has authority over everything that he has made. Everything belongs to God. The Acts of the Apostles, we hear the word that in him, God, we live and we move and we have our being. We are only here because of God. The state only exists because God created. The state, therefore, is subordinate to God. It can never take the place of God. No government can ever usurp the place of God. No government can seek to transcend its role by changing universal moral norms that God has established. What happens when a society seeks to take the place of God? Look at history. Communism, the Nazi regime, dictators. Yes, they felt that they were above God, that they could dictate to the church what the church had to do. But what happens when we see these horrible instances when a government seeks to take the place of God? Horrible crimes against humanity, as the Nuremberg trials said. Any government that seeks to take the place of God will inevitably end up doing horrible evil to its citizens. Were people right in defying the communist regimes? Absolutely. Were people right in defying the Nazis? Absolutely. Are we as Catholics obliged to defy immoral laws? Absolutely. Now, please understand, I'm not advocating we go out into the streets and overturn the government. No. But what I'm saying is that we can never, in the name of civil law, condone evil or negative, intrinsically wrong actions. Ultimately, Christ wants to protect us with these words, what I would call a dualist mentality. Christ doesn't say it's either the state or God. Christ is saying that it is the state within the order God has set up. In other words, we as Catholics must understand that there is a proper hierarchy. And if we truly have God as the supreme value, everything else in our lives will be in its right order. The state, the family, our friendships, our relationships, but only if we have the proper hierarchy. We don't have a dualist mentality where we separate things out. And this, brothers and sisters, is the great evil and the great mistake of so-called Catholic politicians who privately say they're opposed to intrinsic evils but publicly promote them. Jesus condemns this dualist mentality. Those who would say, well, I'm a Christian at church, but a pagan at home and in public is not a Christian. We cannot separate our personal lives of faith from our public life as Catholics. Why? Because in so doing, we would be refusing to render to God what is God's, because God alone is the supreme value. If I would in any way try to promote, as a politician, anything that is intrinsically evil, I begin to invert the proper hierarchy of reality. I am basically saying that there is something that is more important than God in my life. And this is precisely what Christ condemns in the life of the Pharisees. Christ doesn't condemn the Pharisees because they are extremely religious, because they're observant, because they're legalistic. Christ condemns the Pharisee for their dualism, for their hypocrisy. Listen to what Christ says in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 23. This is very important. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses. Practice and observe everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. What is Christ saying? Christ is saying that what the Pharisees preach is true. We should do it. But the Pharisees themselves do not live what they preach. This is hypocrisy. And in many ways, this gospel shows the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. First of all, the Pharisees, in order to try to trap Christ, what do? They collaborate with the Herodians. The Pharisees were very clear and very vocal about the fact that the Roman occupation of the Holy Land was something evil. And yet, in order to trap Christ, what do? They form a coalition with the Herodians, who are very much willing to accept Roman rule. But there's even another point that perhaps we don't immediately pick up on in today's gospel. And that is the point of the coin used to pay the census tax. This shows the supreme hypocrisy of the Pharisees. On the one hand, the Pharisees say we should not in any way support the evil Roman government. What do you say, Christ? And Christ, what does he do? Show me the coin in your pocket. They produce the coin. The coin produced by the Pharisees was the very coin used to pay the census tax. So in principle, the Pharisees said we should not do this, but in practice, they did it. Not only that, but Jesus says, whose image? And what is the inscription on the coin? The gospel doesn't mention the inscription, but this is very important for us to understand. The coin in question is the silver Roman denarius. On one side, it had the head of Tiberius Caesar, and it said Tiberius Caesar is the son of the divine Augustus. And on the other side of the coin, it declared him to be the high priest. So these Pharisees are walking around saying, we only worship God. God is the supreme value. God is, and God alone is the one we're supposed to worship. Were carrying in their pockets a coin that said, Caesar is God. Hypocrites. But Jesus, when he speaks these words, wasn't just speaking to the Pharisees. Jesus is speaking to us here and now. Brothers and sisters, we as believers have to understand that unless we truly acknowledge God as the supreme value in our life, we are being hypocrites. Catholics who say they're Catholic, but then collaborate with immoral principles or immoral practices for their own convenience or for political profit, are not only hypocrites, but they actually commit the sin of idolatry because they're placing the state or something else before God. And this is what Jesus condemns. This is what Jesus reproaches. Again, in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, Jesus asks a rhetorical question. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? What can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man will come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will repay each according to what he has done. When we stand before God, brothers and sisters, and I think we all know this is the case, we will be judged not by what we believe in theory, but how we have lived in practice. If someone asked you, are you a Catholic? Would you say, well, in theory? If you went to the doctor and you had a very severe illness, and the doctor gave you a medicine and you said, doctor, is this medicine going to work? Well, in theory. It hasn't been tried out. We don't know if it works in practice, but in theory. If you go to the mechanic and he gives you a part for your car, and you ask him, well, now will my car run? Well, maybe in theory. Why do we not accept things like that in theory, but only in practice when it comes to material things? But when it comes to our Catholic faith, we're very willing to say, yes, we're Catholics in theory, but not live as Catholics in practice. Any Catholic who says they are Catholic, but does not practice privately or publicly their faith, is a Catholic in theory, not a Catholic in practice. And this, brothers and sisters, are very severe words of Christ. Jesus severely condemns all forms of dualism, all false dichotomies, or faith or works. No, as a Catholic, we believe that faith and works, not just faith, not just works. As Catholics, we believe that we must truly be loyal citizens, that if we are truly, first and foremost, people who are willing to obey God, we will then obey our country. We would do what is best for our country. That is why Jesus tells us, if you want to be my follower, you must first and foremost understand that as a follower of mine, you must give to God what is God's. Everything else then will be in its proper order. Because if we don't have a proper hierarchy, if God is not the supreme value, then brothers and sisters, nothing in our lives will truly be in its proper order. In the end, Christ truly asks us to understand one thing. If we are called to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God, then let us never forget in whose image we are made.